So here is another look at a Nikon lens. This is a short, relatively short portrait type telephoto lens, and this is the 85mm 1.8 AFD. So this is quite a popular lens in its time. This is the older version, the non-AFS version with aperture ring. And I prefer this older version because it can be used with older manual focus cameras, and I also prefer the external design of this one to the new AFS version of the lens. So there's not much really to say about this lens, except that it is a very sort of simple design. It only has the aperture ring and the focus ring for control. It has a window for the distance scale, and it has depth of field points for f11 and f16. It only stops down to f16, but it opens up to 1.8, which is of course very fast. And as you can see, the lens is very wide, and you can see a very large aperture through there. That's 1.8. If you were to stop it down to f16, you'll see that only a very small opening remains. So that's the advantage of this lens, is the very fast f1.8 speed, which not only allows low light photography, it also means that you can have a very narrow depth of field, which is good for isolating subjects against an out of focus background. But although f1.8, the depth of field is very small, and you'll end up with, if you were taking a picture of a portrait, for example, a picture of a person, you may find that f1.8, the eyes are in focus but the end of the nose is not, or something like that, so you might need to step down a little bit more. The lens, as is standard for a AFD lens, or a Nikon AF lens, has a aperture lock for the smallest aperture, which is generally used on AF bodies. It has the standard AF contacts for a non-AFS lens, the Ai-S cutout, because Nikon AF-N and AF standard and AFD lenses are Ai-S lenses as well if they have an aperture ring. And you can see the very wide, large piece of glass for the very fast 1.8 aperture. You can see this has markings along the internal side of the glass within the filter ring. This is a 62mm filter ring, and you can see the very clear reflections in the glass. This is a good example, relatively recent manufacture, and there's no markings on the glass. This one was made in Japan. I think the very latest ones were made in Thailand, and this symbol is a indication for, I think, Chinese regulations as to the lifespan of the product expected. Although, given that it's a relatively simple device without a motor or anything, you'd expect it to have a much longer lifespan than 10 years. It probably is about 10 years old as it stands. So, let's take a quick look at the packaging. This I bought second hand actually from eBay, and it happened to come with the packaging. So it has unfortunately it has the polystyrene foam, which isn't my favourite type of packaging, just because of the noise it makes. And you can see that inside you have the lens, and also the lens hood. This comes standard with actually a metal lens hood, a Nikon HN23, which screws into the filter ring. I'll show you that in a moment. And it comes with the standard Nikon type paper instructions, and also a little indication from the this is the fellow I bought it from. He put a little note in there, which is nice. So this is the lens hood. It's metal, and it screws into the filter ring. So you can see on the inside it has matte finish on the inside to prevent reflections. There isn't a filter ring on the inside of the lens hood, which means if you want to use a filter at the same time, you have to screw the lens hood into the front of the filter rather than onto the front of the lens. It's very simple to attach. You very carefully put it onto the filter ring and screw it in. Unfortunately, it's a plastic filter ring on the lens. And you have that doesn't interfere. This is actually a rear focus lens, which means that the front elements do not move when you focus, and in fact it's the rear elements that move. And this obviously means that the lens doesn't change shape when you focus it, and also there's less ways for dust to get inside, and obviously it doesn't interfere with filters or with the lens hood, which is a nice touch. So with the lens hood on, it's quite a nice shape. This being a metal lens hood, it's subject to the propensity for dents perhaps, but it's at least a nicer finish than a plastic one. Now obviously, because this is a lens hood that widens towards the end, you can no longer fit the 62mm lens cap on. However, a 77mm lens cap does fit on the end, so you can still use a lens cap using the lens hood. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a 77mm filter ring around the edge. That might have been a more useful feature, but never mind. So a quick word about using the lens on a manual focus camera. It fits beautifully, and it's easy to use on a manual focus camera. Obviously you need to adjust the aperture in the traditional way, unless of course you're using a 601M, but that's a very unusual camera to have. In terms of manual focusing, it's fairly typical for an AFD type lens. It's not the best manual focus feel, but it's certainly usable. It's a little bit loose compared to a proper manual focus lens, but it's easy to set a particular focus distance, and the focus ring is actually, the distance markings are actually quite well spaced in that respect. One thing, the lens is actually quite large, and on a smaller body, it does project beneath the base of the camera, and the camera doesn't sit flat with the lens on, and that means there's weight on the lens, which may not be the best way of storing it. So keep that in mind. But otherwise, it's a very easy lens to use on a manual focus camera. In terms of using the lens on a autofocus camera, or a more recent autofocus camera or digital camera, the method of use is typical for a Nikon AF lens. You generally set the aperture to the smallest aperture scale. You can set the lock if you like, and then it's a simple matter of switching on the camera. Now this is an AFD lens, not an AFS lens, which means you don't have instant override of the focus ring. When you focus, you have to actually switch the focus mode on the camera to manual mode if you wish to focus manually, and that's something you have to remember. You can't just grab it, because if you do, you'll stress the motor and the linkage, which isn't the best. So that's one downside of a non-AFS lens, but you certainly get used to it. On a camera like the F5, the focus is still very fast, even if it is a bit noisy, and it isn't a very large distance between infinity and the closest focus distance. The closest focus distance is 0.85 meters, or 2.8 feet or thereabouts, so it's relatively close. And it's still relatively fast on a lower cost camera like a F70 or an F80 or a D80 or a cheaper AF camera. So here we have some example images from the 85mm 1.8D, and concentrating on the type of subject, portrait type subjects the lens is intended for. So here is a picture of a statue in a cemetery in Aberdeen, and this is a way of showing the image quality at different apertures while still maintaining the isolation effect of a wide aperture. So there are two versions of this subject. The first one, which is this image you can see, and this is taken at f1.8, and then a second image taken at f2.8. And I've done a zoom in, which is roughly 1:1 pixel resolution, allowing you to compare the fine detail. For this example, which is at a sort of medium distance, the difference between wide open at 1.8 and 2.8 isn't very great. So here's another example on a war memorial in the centre of Aberdeen. Again, this is a comparison between wide open and a smaller aperture, and this image at a slightly closer distance shows a little bit more contrast between the two images in terms of image quality. You can see that in the f1.8 close-up there's more fringing around the profile of the statue on the left in the close-up. So it's an example of the kind of sharpness the lens is capable of. You can see the pigeon is very sharp and the background very soft. So some concluding remarks. The optical quality is very good indeed. It's a very, very sharp lens. It obviously allows low light photography and good isolation with the fast 1.8 aperture. It's relatively well made. It isn't made of metal. Looking at the filter rings, I thought they were plastic, but looking closely, the internal part of the filter ring might be metal, so that's quite good. And obviously the internals of the lens are metal, but it's relatively good plastic, and it feels relatively solid. It feels more solid, for instance, than the recent 50mm 1.8D, and also surpasses that in picture quality. The image quality is better from this lens, especially wide open, than from the 50mm 1.8. I haven't seen the more recent AFS version of this lens, the G, so I can't comment on that. But this, I'm very happy with this lens. It is a excellent performer and relatively well made, and obviously I prefer the older version, given that I use my f3 as well as my other cameras, but it works just as well on a film camera as on a digital camera. So yes, a very excellent and affordable portrait lens from Nikon. Now there is a 1.4 version of this, both AFS and AFD. That is metal, but it's significantly more expensive and not much faster, and is also larger and heavier. So it's up to you whether you think that extra half a stop and slightly better build quality is worth the significantly greater expense. I think it costs more than twice what this costs, new or used, and is also larger in size. So that's a decision for you to make.